Hey guys, welcome back to Parkitect. Today I'm working on a pretty complex building for the log flume to go through, as well as a string of facades alongside the lake here, and also a small transition part into the Japanese area, though I'm gonna save the making of the Japanese area itself for the next episode, or episodes probably, and it might also take quite a while before I actually get that done. But the Roman area is more or less finished at this stage, and I just sort of need to get into the foliage around this section of the park and the park in general at some point in the future, but that's just something I want to avoid for the time being, so I'll just focus on the scenery and the buildings just around this lake. So the first thing I wanted to work on is the, I wouldn't really know what to call it. It's sort of like a compound building with lots of different small facades over here. The idea is very Escape from Pompeii-ish in concept. There's this big, almost mountain-like creation of buildings which the log flume goes through and the lift hills go up to, and you eventually have these drops which come out of these buildings and are like the central point of this lake here. And in that sense it's really similar to Escape from Pompeii, but I wanted to do something slightly different in this case because that ride has a very flat, sort of simple facade, and it's also really made as if it were like the ruins of Pompeii, so it's definitely really devastated and kind of like a rubble, and I wanted to make this look a little bit more clean, almost like it's a sort of village that's placed alongside a cliff face and very compact and on different levels, just to make it look a bit more interesting and more alive than the real dead facades of Escape from Pompeii. And it's also pretty helpful in the general sense of forced perspective, I feel, in this building, because one of the most important things in how this general area is laid out, and what's really central to the idea of the log flume, although it's not very original, it's something that is very common in log flumes, but the central idea is really that you have this large building over here which is behind the lake, to have that forced perspective of having it further away from any other buildings, so it really stands on its own, making it look a little bit bigger than it actually is, which is reinforced by having the log flumes come out of the building, just making it look even taller than it really is, and also making the drops of the log flume look a bit bigger. And I wanted to also play with that by making the buildings just a string of very small parts and nooks that would stick out, and yeah, just loads of different smaller pieces and parts of the building in general, just to make it look a little bit bigger and interesting than just one simple facade. And it's really a stacked kind of city in that sense, and there isn't really much of a thought behind all of the buildings which I built. It was just generally the general idea of having all of these small parts over here and sort of stack them up until it turned into a hill of a building, and really just go with that as a general plan and just make every single part of the building a little bit different, much like the rest of the buildings in the Roman area. But it's, there's no real central planning or plan behind it. I just wanted to get a general shape, and the details of the building don't even matter that much, I would say. Though, as I would always like to do, there is that one sort of signature part of the building. I wanted to have one part which would just be the biggest part and really give an idea of what the building looks like in general, so that's why I made the part where the largest drop comes out a little bit larger and very similar to the temples in Rome, just to make that sort of like the signature part and the most iconic part of the building, just to give it, I would say a bit of an identity, but that's perhaps not the right word for it, just to make it, to give the building some sort of form which is recognizable, instead of just being one big blob of small parts where you can't really make out any sort of central thing to it. So yeah, that was the general idea, but as soon as that was done, I just started adding these little bits and bobs all around the place and just made all of these little building blobs to make sure that the general shape of the building was all done. It's also a bit more interesting with having like all of the different parts of the buildings in different heights and different levels sort of hang over each other, and having the log flume go through it. There's like a lot of interaction between the building parts and the log flume, kind of just going through each other. It's very like an interweaving kind of way. Which, yeah, that's just the general idea behind the building. I might, in hindsight, have switched up the style a little bit more. Like, in the end, the Roman area did turn out to be very similar in style. There isn't as much of a difference in terms of roof colors or details. I also feel it might be a bit washed out, so I may return to that, as in the colors are quite washed out. But then again, I also wanted to get that sort of idea because it's just the general sort of aesthetic of Roman buildings. Hence also why I wanted to go with all of these sort of beige colors, but give all the different parts of the buildings slightly different beige colors. Or sometimes even some shades of white-ish colors, but still keep the very small trims and borders as ways to add some extra accents and extra contrasting colors to the buildings, as opposed to just having white walls and just leaving it at that. I also decided to actually make the rockwork a bit more interesting than what I had in the rest of the park so far, so it's also something that I might want to return to in the rest of the park as well, because there's quite a lot of smaller pebbles and stuff like that in this rockwork. So I might want to add some extra detail to the existing rockwork. What I didn't want to do though is add water lilies to this part of the lake, since it's just a lake with a log flume all over the lake, and I'm not entirely sure, but I am quite sure that water lilies wouldn't really work out well in this case. Not to mention that in a body of water which isn't moving, as soon as you have water lilies, they're sort of like all over the place. They don't really sit in one corner, but if you add them, you kind of need to add them everywhere, and it's just something that doesn't really work well with the log flume. So that's something I kind of missed out on. And with having all of the rockwork and all of the buildings on the sides of the lake, I also couldn't really get too many bulrushes in, and it was hard to get in foliage, but I still wanted to keep some foliage, like these small bushes and trees here and there, to add a bit of greenery to this general area, because I was quite afraid that if I didn't add it, it would just become one big massive slab of concrete and bricks, and that's something I didn't want to quite have. I wanted to make it look a little bit more natural than that. Not to mention that cypresses are probably a really easy and good way to make anything look Mediterranean. I guess as long as you just keep slapping cypresses in a certain area, it's gonna look somewhat Mediterranean at least. So yeah, that's why I also wanted to go ahead and do that. Now over here on this side of the lake is the sort of, I would say, Portaventura-ish inspired part of the park, though it wasn't much except for just looking up the Portaventura facades, thinking, yep, I could go for something like that, getting into the game and just building parts at random. It's again not something that I planned at all, and really just like I didn't even plan the building shapes or anything even slightly ahead. You just kind of go along as you build, and it's pretty easy to do. You don't really need to think about anything that you're really doing, and generally if you bump into something which doesn't look as good, you just remove it and move on, and it's a lot of fun to work that way. It's not really the most effective way, and it's definitely not the best for perhaps making the best looking things, but it is just a lot of fun, and it's pretty fast as well, so that's why I wanted to go for that approach over here. Not to mention that these are pretty simple buildings, like these are not any of the big weenies or the main centers of attention in the theme park, so they're just sort of side buildings, so I didn't really care for them that much, so this approach really worked for these buildings. As long as the facade sort of is dynamic in the end, so there are loads of different pieces to look at, and the buildings aren't quite as straight and rectangular or predictable, but it's more or less almost a very organic mess of buildings. I also had to quickly delete that part of the building though. I did have some bigger plans with that building, but I completely forgot about the suspended monorail, so that didn't quite work out. So I can't really extend it beyond that, so in the future I'll actually connect that path in the corner there to the Japanese area, but I also wanted to have another connection to the Japanese area to make this facade over here a little bit more interesting than just one string of straight buildings. So by having this little path, I wanted to make a small set of towers and a large arch, just to have that sort of building go over the path and not just have the same buildings in this string of facades. So it's kind of interesting because it was also a way to get a more castle-ish Roman piece of building, if I could call it that, in this part of the Roman area, because it's not really very typical of the Roman themes in general, but Rome did have some city walls, and of course Roman cities also had city walls, and it's something which I didn't really have yet, and I figured I might as well make this look a bit more atmospheric and Roman-like by having a small sort of city wall gate over here, which just seemed like not just fun to build, but also quite practical in that it was just another entrance into the Japanese area. In case the Japanese area gets a lot of attention and many people want to go there from here, it could realistically also handle quite some larger crowds. And the other path that is sort of pointlessly going over the lake is just purely for cosmetic reasons. I just felt like having a small pier stick out from the large hill of buildings which the log flume goes into, and it would be quite nice to have that small path go underneath the log flumes where you can just walk to kind of watch the log flumes and just kind of watch that happen if you're like me and you don't even dare to ride log flumes. So yeah, that's something I wanted to get in there like that. And here I dipped into another little activity. One thing which I really wanted to do, and I've said this in the last episode as well, is actually add some hills to the park. Because it's called Cydonia Hills, so it better damn well have some hills too, to actually live up to its name, I guess. So I wanted to have some quick hills, but it doesn't just work better for the park reasons. One of the reasons why I felt the park just felt really empty on the outside. Like, obviously it is going to be empty because I won't add anything outside of the park, really. But it really felt so empty and repetitive and predictable, so I wanted to add some hills instead of just making it flat. And add some more foliage on top of that to see how it would work, and it's very heavily inspired by the like the general areas around the Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 scenarios, especially hills that you would see in Diamond Heights or Katie's World, scenarios like that. If anybody remembers them, like you'd always have this small park, which is like one small part of the map, and the entire map would always be filled with all of these gridded hills, because that's how the hills in Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 worked as well, with just random foliage on it and maybe some scenery here and there. And that's just something I wanted to have for this park as well, because I won't really get into a realistic surrounding with parking lots or backstage spaces like the huge halls or yeah, some sort of backstage buildings that you usually see in theme parks, and instead wanted to have that sort of Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 approach to the outside of the park, where you feel like you're part, like the park is located in some sort of world. But aside from that, it's pretty standard and anonymous, but still quite a fun thing to look at probably. So yeah, moving on, I wanted to make a quick transition area into the Japanese area. I wasn't actually quite sure how I wanted to do this at first, so I just figured, YOLO, I'm gonna go for something. Made that quick little square, which is actually pretty nice and works out pretty well in the end, just to connect those two paths together before they go underneath a can I spoil this yet? I probably can. Before they go underneath a torii gate, like one of these typical Japanese gates. And you actually transition into the Japanese area properly. So this is sort of like a general transition area where nothing interesting is happening, no real rides, some simple buildings and just a bit of foliage just to make sure that the transition isn't suddenly you're in Rome and suddenly you're in Japan, but there's sort of a little more gradual thing. And obviously I wanted to create a simple connection between the Alpine area and the Japanese area as well. So you can sort of use this path over here to skip over the Roman area if you're not into Roman areas and just go straight to the Japanese area. Which you can do at another part of the park as well, but that's quite a bit further away from this part, so I figured it would be nice to add that quick shortcut over here as well. And it's, well, truth be told, it's also a pretty good way to fill in this empty space. I don't want to have too much empty spaces, like a little bit of greenery and forestry and bushery and shrubbery in some general areas of the park is okay, but I don't want to like make too large areas just completely open, especially given that the map size isn't really big and I still have quite some sizable plans for the future. I do want to keep it open a little bit. Okay, so this is where I then tried to make a torii gate, or perhaps I should say torii, but actually pretty miserably failed a couple of times at first, because the horizontal pieces that I wanted to use are obviously all just, well, they're all tied to the grid, so I can't really make anything of them but just place them exactly on the grid, which was kind of annoying because I wanted to actually go off-grid a little bit there, and I was hoping to be able to get a 2 square wide path underneath this thing to have it connect very neatly to the gate itself, which turned out to be impossible, so instead had to have this 1 tile path go underneath it, sort of use the pillars to make this gate seem a little bit more offset than it actually is, and have some small paths around it just to make sure that it can actually deal with all the people that might want to go into the Japanese area, because obviously a 1 square path is pretty small, and in general it also keeps the it also helps to keep the general area around the gates a little bit more open, and allows for some small gardens around the gates, just to make the gates a little bit more visible and more like it's a proper part of scenery, and more like it's a proper transition into the Japanese area as well. So yeah, that's why I wanted to do it this way. I don't actually have any plans for the Japanese area specifically though, but with every time I talk about this, I'm increasingly sure that I want to make a B&M invert, so I'll probably get into that. But the Japanese style itself is something that I still need to play around with a bit more, because I'm not quite sure how I'm going to actually tackle it at the moment, because I just haven't really tried it yet. So I still want to make a couple of sort of test buildings, and after that, hopefully, I might have enough courage to start work on the Japanese area. But at the moment, I am not quite sure how it's gonna exactly work out, so I'll need to procrastinate a little bit and work on some other stuff that I kind of want to do as well. But yeah, that is right about it for this episode. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.